Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Gérard Lasfargues. I'm a professor of occupational medicine and currently managing director general of Anses, the French agency for food, environmental and occupational health and safety. And I will chair this session. During we have three key speakers. Thomas Burke from Johns Hopkins University, Richard Bourne from WHO, and Myriam Merad from the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in France. So, as you probably know, we had last week two plenary sessions concerning the credibility of scientific expertise and decision making, one more general and another more specific concerning the health COVID crisis. So the goal of this session today is mainly to see how the reference framework for risk assessment has evolved to adapt to change in the science of risk assessments, also to face with the current major issues in this changing world, like, of course, One Health. It's perfectly actual, but also global exposure, sustainability, or other important concepts for environmental health, like climate change. And what can be the capacity of this framework of risk assessment to address this more systemic question and influence the process of decision making. And also, beyond this frame of reference itself, how can the forms, the method of expertise and risk assessment, the practices of group of experts change, and which level of integration between science and public policy can we get today? So many questions and very interesting, I hope, session. And first, I like to introduce Thomas Burke from Johns Hopkins University. Thomas Burke is currently professor and chair in health risk and society at Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health in the Department of Health Policy and Management, with a joint appointment in the Department of Environmental Health Engineering. In the past, previously, he was an advisor of the EPA in USA, and he was also chair of the National Academy of Science Committee on Improving Risk Analysis that produced the report Science and Decisions, and currently serves as chair of the Environmental Health Matters Initiative of the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine. So, Thomas Burke, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gerard. It's a pleasure to be here. And I would like to talk today about, it's been 12 years since the Silver Book, the framework, and I would like to first start out as a professor with a quiz for everyone and ask a question that I was always asked when I was the head scientist of the US EPA by the administrator, Gina McCarthy, when I would brief her on scientific issues. And she would say, Tom, why are you doing this? Because sometimes, as you know, scientists don't bring the answers that policymakers want. So I thought it would be important for all of us to think about what is the goal of risk assessment. And being a professor, I just offer this slide so everyone can begin to think about why we do risk analysis. First, are we trying to develop a point of reference, a reference dose, a bright line for decision making? Are we informing regulations? Are we trying to determine what a safe level of exposure is? Identify hazards, conduct dose response modeling, identify research needs, estimate the probability, after all, it is a risk assessment of an adverse health effect, or make better decisions. So think about that. Think about what answers. Some of you might say we're trying to do all those things, but it's so important as we look at our framework to ask the fundamental question, why are we doing this? And as an epidemiologist, I want to give you my answer. We're doing this to protect public health. I'll talk more about that later. But first I want to talk about the Silver Book, the framework. As I mentioned, it's 12 years old now, and there's the group that put it together, the Silver Book, Science and Decisions, looking 12 years younger. It's been a tough time for science, particularly in the US. But as you know, we developed the framework, and it was no easy task. So I kept notes from the early deliberations, and I thought it would be interesting to share the early drafts. And as you can see, this is the scribblings of Dr. Joe Rodericks, who I consider a mentor and a giant in the risk analysis field. But if you see, that's figure 9.1, really the framework in its earliest form. And the top says a solutions-based framework. So we really wanted the framework to give us better solutions to risk challenges from the earliest start. From those early scribbles and drawings came what we now know as the framework. And this was very much an evolution of the early 1983 Red Book, 4 steps of risk assessment. And you can see we really emphasized problem formulation, asking the right questions up front. What are we trying to do here? Again, that question, why are we doing this? The middle phase is about the conduct of the risk assessment, but very much more involved than just the 4 steps in the production of an estimate or a bright line. Really a careful planning phase to address the appropriate level of acceptable uncertainty. And a step 3, did this work? To confirm the utility, did we get this right? And then finally, the 3rd phase is so important, making the right decisions, the solutions part of it. I might also say at the bottom, but not bottom in importance, was our hope that there would be very much a transparent, interactive, and inclusive process. So there's the framework. And I think, of course, I may be biased because I chaired the committee, but I think it still stands the test of time, and it is a very good foundation to move forward. So what were the key conclusions and recommendations? Well, we talked about the design of a risk assessment. We talked about uncertainty and variability, very important variability. The selection and use of defaults. As we know, there are many assumptions and defaults that we build into a risk analysis. Perhaps the most controversial thing was we recommended a unified approach to dose response assessment, getting away from the dichotomy between cancer and non-cancer, threshold and non-threshold. We tried to advance the application of cumulative risk assessment, and above all, improve the utility of risk analysis with stakeholder involvement. And finally, as a professor, I always have to put the final recommendation. This doesn't work unless we teach people the right way, unless we build capacity and teach future generations. And as I said, the framework has served us well, but we are now all locked away. I'm coming to you from my home instead of Paris. COVID-19 is a wake-up call for all of us. I think it's causing us to recalibrate our ideas about risk, to see the limitations of the framework, and to open our eyes to a much broader approach to risk analysis. In addition, the nature of our environmental challenges is changing. It's no longer one single molecule, one single pathway. Climate change, environmental justice, those are the 2 top priorities, I might say, for the Biden administration. as we in the US begin to get back on track in environmental health and public health. But water quality and quantity, food production and food safety, air quality, chemical risks, not just one molecule at a time, thinking of things like the PFAS and the fluorinated compounds, but families of exposures and cumulative exposure to thousands of low-dose exposures at the same time. Decisions about transportation, the future of energy and land use are also new types of problems that we must solve and think about how this framework addresses them. So another committee that I was a part of at the National Academy of Sciences was trying to look forward in the science for environmental protection. And we recognize that in a changing world, today's problems are wicked problems. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, they're affected by many, many interacting factors. They have various spatial and temporal scales. They're global and difficult to characterize, and they're unstable and socially very complex. Complexity is really the nature of our environmental challenges now. And because of that complexity, there is no one clear solution. Think of issues like climate. There is not one solution. It has to really be a unified approach. And important for us as the scientific community, they extend beyond one discipline. They will take all of the sciences, all of our disciplines to really work together on these wicked challenges. Now, in addition, let's face it, there's a lot going on in the risk sciences. There's a change in the nature of the way we see problems, not necessarily one issue, oh, arsenic is a big problem. No, we now see the system, the big issue. We're recognizing the social and behavioral factors. And COVID, I think, was really a wake-up call on this, to look at social, behavioral factors, environmental justice, environmental racism, pre-existing conditions, host factors, vulnerability and susceptibility, and the built environment. All of these things really influence risk. There's actions in the US to revise current guidelines and questioning of the role of science. And frankly, as we've seen from the IARC attacks by politicians on the glyphosate decision at IARC and the EPA IRIS program, there's been a political assault on science. The transparency rule that the Trump administration put forth put great limits on data, and including epidemiology and human studies. It also foisted upon the EPA decision-making reconsideration of models, advancing threshold approaches and questioning the linear no threshold model. So in the US, we grapple with this because of the new toxic substances law, but really globally, we're thinking about the changes away from animal toxicology, new toxicology. We have conflicts with independence and peer review, thinking about cost benefit and providing the right kind of information to our policymakers. And then also getting away, as we try to advocate in the Silver Book, away from single substance, single hazard to understanding background risks, population risks, and vulnerability. I can't really emphasize too much the politics of risk assessment. It's been particularly acute in the United States, where even masks during the COVID outbreak became a political issue rather than a scientific issue. And simple measures of risk management that we would have accepted before have really become political challenges. In addition, on the chemical side, there's a partisan debate over how the Environmental Protection Agency and other agencies do risk assessment. And these are just an examples of some of the US headlines where industry has gotten the attention of certain political actors to really challenge and change the way that we do risk analysis. And unfortunately, that has been manifest in our regulatory agencies in the US in the way that we conduct these analyses. So I mentioned in the new administration that environmental justice and protection of vulnerable populations will be a very important part of the new administration. Well, the Silver Book did address this. We said that variability in human susceptibility had really not received significant and consistent attention in risk analysis. And we urged that the EPA and all of us who use the framework move forward to quantify variability more explicitly, particularly in our exposure assessment and dose response relationships. Because, as we know, and really this could be a graph of any agent and exposure, think of COVID, there are susceptible subgroups. We know from pre-existing conditions, we know from certain occupational groups, we know in the US, certainly racial and ethnic backgrounds contribute to this, but there's a risk to the average population, the red line. There are some folks that are less susceptible to infection or to adverse effects. But risk analysis, our framework really has to consider those susceptible subgroups too. So how do we protect all parts of the population? And we have to ask ourselves the questions, does our risk analysis really do this? Are our current uncertainty factors, are our current models really adequate to do this? And it was very controversial that we took on the assumption that is just a cornerstone of risk analysis, of threshold for non-cancer risk analysis. There's an assumption of a threshold, and if you address uncertainty with uncertainty factors, one of the assumptions that has really supported polluters for decades is that attempt to get below the reference dose, get below some threshold, which we felt really, given the variability in the population, does not exist. So here you see, and again, you can think of it through the lens of your favorite exposure or even COVID. There's the healthy background population where there might be no adverse effect. There's a healthy population with background exposure, say inner city populations with high air pollution. They may have more susceptibility and vulnerability to respiratory threats, for instance. And then there are vulnerable populations with background exposure. And there you see there could be a considerable area under the curve where the population is affected by the adverse exposure. These are very important considerations. And because of this, we really move forward to unify the dose response assessment, to have a consistent approach to risk assessment for both cancer and non-cancer effects. We felt it scientifically feasible to quantify that risk, to not just depend upon bright lines of yes, no, and to move forward to help our decision-making with the quantification of risk, both for cancer and non-cancer effect. Because as we now know, the world is divided into two parts in risk. There's non-cancer, where our quest is to identify the no observed adverse effect level. And even when we can't, we assume that it's there by using the lowest observed adverse effect level and develop a reference dose built upon this approach. Whereas in cancer risk assessment, we work to understand the mechanism, develop the dose response curve, perhaps develop a point of departure or quantify the number of adverse effects we might expect. And we called for doing this for all endpoints. It's the only way to make better decisions. A reference dose provides so little information to decision makers. It's just a yes, no. The bright line, really, we advocated moving past that. We need new approaches. So I'd like to finish with a few examples and some thought about how we go from here. Now, this paper in 2017, written by a colleague of mine at the Environmental Protection Agency, the chief economist from EPA, took the recommendations of the Silver Book and has been working and advocating, again, for that unified approach. Because as an economist, those reference doses did not really give him an estimate of risk, and he proposed changes to provide qualitative descriptors of non-cancer for all endpoints to get away from that, and a dose response assessment that gives a quantitative expression of the change in risk. So you can compare and make better decisions. You will quantify risks, not just a bright line, an estimate of adverse effects, and an inclusion of all adverse outcomes. I feel that the future will be a public health approach that draws upon the way public health professionals have looked at epidemiology and the full data streams, the vulnerability of the host, the agent, and the environment. When we consider the ultimate goal, as I said, which I think is public health, we should work toward prevention, not prediction and bright lines, to provide the right information to our public officials and make better public health decisions. I think we have to rethink those point estimates. Maybe really it is the end of the reference dose. And it's time to rethink acceptable risks in terms of community risk. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's take cardiovascular risk. You could also take COVID here. But look at the environmental factors associated with cardiovascular risk. Obviously, one of the most controversial aspects of the current science debate is the relationship between particulate matter and disease and mortality. Well, clearly clean air has effect on community levels of cardiovascular disease. And there are also built environmental aspects and recreation, but really when you think of the contributing factors to your risk or my risk of cardiovascular disease, there's diet, physical activity, tobacco and alcohol, cholesterol, access to health care and preventive care, and socioeconomic status. How do we justify such a narrow lens for risk assessment if we don't consider the context of the environment in a broader sense, the social environment, and the individual host factors? So in a paper that we did with colleagues at EPA, we tried to apply this public health lens to our current framework. And on the left in this slide, you see the traditional risk assessment, where we're really trying to look at synthesizing and characterizing risks, taking a look at the strength of the evidence and doing a traditional estimate of risk and hazard index or reference dose or an estimate of cancer risk. Now, if we really think about that question, why do we do this? We do this to improve public health. So we advocate considering complementing the current framework with a public health approach, where we start with the adverse health effect we're trying to prevent. We look at clinical data. We look at molecular epidemiology and population exposure information and behavioral data, all of the data sources, and synthesize how we might best find solutions to this challenge, this public health challenge. At the National Academies, I'm again honored to chair the Environmental Health Matters Initiative, and we've taken this even further to take a look at our wicked problems in the U.S. And we've taken on drinking water, we've taken on agriculture and food safety, we're taking on PFAS, and recently we took on COVID. Well, how do you think about solutions for environmental health risks? Well, it's the same at the center of this circle. We're looking at individual health and exposure and health effects, very much like the framework. But we really have extended our lens to be much more of a systems lens, to think of the social context of risk and who might affect it, what are the kinds of things within a community or a nation that are really important to making progress on reducing environmental risks. This is a complicated multi-centers here, but it's a new approach to complement our framework to include everything from the social determinants to the institutional determinants from public health to healthcare, to the politics, which are so important. And that final ring on the outside is who can do something about this? Because one of the things that's very important in success in risk management is who's in charge, who has the responsibility, who can influence things. I want to quickly mention health impact assessment as a wonderful tool that should be considered for expansion and complementing the risk framework because it brings together, it uses a systems lens to consider input from stakeholders to determine the broader systems aspects of decisions. And I can only imagine, had we had this lens, we could have prevented the disaster of Flint, Michigan. We would have looked upstream. We would have looked at a systems approach rather than just setting narrow standards, narrow acceptable risk for so many important societal problems. So I want to finish with some recommendations on rethinking and meeting the challenges of a changing world. This is a nice reference to a paper that I wrote with others at EPA about this and how we think about the future. Today's problems call for a systems approach to include drivers and stressors that affect and the dimensions that frame it, that integrates information from human health, ecological, and social sciences, and really has as its endpoint that why, sustainable solutions. So thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take questions and very glad to participate in discussion.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much,
Gérard.
Thomas, for this excellent presentation and that provide to us a very good and holistic vision of the framework of risk assessments. So you can ask a question. You have a specific question and answer plot to ask your question to the different speaker. And I see already one question that is what for a changing world from Cro-Magnon. I don't know if it's a question or simply in a remark, but we can see with the presentation of Thomas that we are clearly in a changing world, and the different needs for the change in risk assessment. I have a first question concerning the notion of environmental justice. You speak about this notion and how to take that in the risk assessment method beyond simply the elaboration of specific coefficient of safety coefficient, for example, for the toxicological reference value. But what can you say about this notion and how to better take into account in the framework of risk assessment?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize and admit that we have not adequately considered environmental justice in our risk analysis framework. I think if you search the entire Silver Book, we talk about variability, susceptibility, vulnerable communities, and cumulative risk, but we did not take environmental justice on in its time. I think the framework allows us to do that, both for cancer and non-cancer risk. But I think we don't really describe variability in the population and environmental justice, as we know, institutional racism, poor housing, poor healthcare, poverty, hazardous occupations, behavioral aspects. All of these things really contribute to overall risk. So I think there are two very important ways to do this. One, in the framework, take a look at background exposure, take a look at the measures of uncertainty and variability, and think, are we adequately considering this community if there is environmental justice issues there? Or are we being very narrow and siloed approach and thinking of just limited pathways or limited exposure? So one thing I would like to see happen is just as we have with COVID, understand the social environment. Perhaps right away we could have adjustment factors for that for our reference dose calculations, just as in some risk assessments, say for pesticides, we've tried to increase those values for children. Now we can also have ways to provide a broader range and perhaps a greater margin of exposure or margin of safety for environmental justice communities. Similarly, we have to bring those social factors in there in consideration of that. And that's why, frankly, it makes me so upset that we think one single bright line, one single reference dose can be really representative of risk for an entire population. We have to get more flexible about that.
Okay, another
Thank you for that
question
question.
is important concerning socioeconomic aspects. And the question is what would the contribution of methods such as cost-benefit analysis to better understand and assess risk and exposure?
Great question. And again, I refer you to the paper I referred to there on rethinking risk by Dr. Al McGartland. Benefit cost analysis is so important to risk management, and it should be part of the framework for the future. So we have our traditional risk analysis. We have benefit cost analysis. Perhaps we have a new adapted environmental justice or susceptibility analysis, and we use things like health impact assessment to inform the full decision. Benefit cost analysis ultimately will be an important driver of which solutions, again, getting to the solution component, that we select. We also have to have clear criteria for how we do it. As you know, the Trump EPA tried to change the way we look at benefits for a global challenge to only include the narrow borders of the US when looking at the costs. So we have to have rigorous peer review, independent involvement of scientists, and integration of the economic endpoints as we redesign the output from a quantitative risk analysis to give economists more to work with. Reference doses do not provide useful material for a start for selecting between options and understanding the differences in cost and benefit.
So
thank you for that very important question.
But we can ask them in the general discussion at the end of this session. We will have a general discussion with the three speakers. So I like now to move to the next speaker, Richard Brown, if it's possible to this presentation. Okay, Dr. Richard Brown is a technical officer with the World Health Organization, working in the Chemical Safety and Health Unit in WHO headquarters in Geneva, in Switzerland, and his professional experience is in toxicology, pesticide regulation, and chemical risk assessment. And his current work involves overseeing the chemical risk assessment activities of the WHO International Program on Chemical Safety and providing the secretariat to the WHO Chemical Risk Assessment Network. Richard, you can speak.
Okay, thank you, Gérard. So I'd like to talk to you today about risk assessment, the changes which I think have occurred in recent years, and some of the challenges which we still face. So I'd like to talk about how has risk assessment changed during the past 10 years or so. It's maybe 12 years since the Silver Book, looking back over that period, and where I think progress has been made, and some of the challenges which still remain for us to deal with. The examples I give will be from the areas of chemical regulation, because that is my background, but I think the concepts are broadly applicable to risk assessment in many disciplines. So this is perhaps what risk assessment looked like in the past. There would be a gathering of probably a group of men, and it usually was men, taken from what would have been considered the scientific establishment. They would have been considered experts in their field. Maybe they had connections with the people who were organizing the meeting. They would choose their own methods of working. They would choose what data they were going to look at. They would reach their own conclusions as individuals about what they thought about the issue. And society, the non-expert community, would be expected to take their word for it. And that was about as far as the process went. The credibility of the decision or the outcome depended on the position and the qualifications of the people who were undertaking the assessment, or perhaps the credibility of the organization convening the meeting, such as the World Health Organization. But that having expertise, I don't think it's no longer sufficient to give you credibility in a process. It's not simply efficient to say we are the experts. So you have seen in Thomas's presentation that the Silver Book made this series of conclusions and recommendations, and I would like to consider how I have seen risk assessment change in respect of some of these. You also saw this framework from the Silver Book, and I'd like to show that sort of in a different way, to describe this. So in the center, you see the green area, the classical risk assessment, what was thought of as traditional risk assessment. So this is the hazard identification, the hazard characterization, or the dose response assessment, the exposure assessment, and the risk characterization. But the Silver Book brought in these other issues which you can see around that center, scoping the assessment to really think what is it for and what is it going to affect. Problem formulation, to plan exactly how you're going to do this, to set out in advance in order to get an outcome which is useful for what you want to know. Consideration of the possible risk management options and how you're going to communicate that outcome to the people you need to make those decisions. These are all important sort of additional considerations to make the risk assessment useful. And coming into that process, opportunities for stakeholder input in order to bring more credibility to the process of people feel that they've had a chance to be involved. Balanced also with transparency, and so that people can see what is going on to understand better and hence feel more comfortable with the outcome that comes out of that process. So these are the recommendations from the book, and I'll talk about some examples for some of these. The green highlighted examples being affecting the classical traditional risk assessment elements, the blue ones some of those wider areas. So the technical details aren't important, they're just illustrations. The top left is an example of dose response assessment, the use of the benchmark dose in this case. And this reflects the recommendation to improve the way that dose response assessments are taken. WHO committees have adopted the benchmark dose approach as the first choice method for dose response assessment. And this is an area where the science has moved on, and the recommendations are following that to say that the more advanced scientific method should be used in dose response assessment instead of the perhaps more basic system that was used in the past. Bottom left shows the WHO framework for combined exposures, which really emphasized the idea of tiers, using different tiers on the hazard side or on the exposure side, which is also a recommendation from the Silver Book, to say that you don't have to have all of the information to do your outcome. You do enough that's necessary to answer the question that you need to answer. And so if you have maybe detailed information on the hazard, but only very basic information on exposure, that may be sufficient in itself to answer a question, or vice versa. And so by introducing tiered assessments, you only do as much work as is needed to do to answer your question. And in order to do this, you have to have already set a problem formulation framework, because you need to have decided how are you going to answer that question. The upper right illustrates a framework from a WHO publication on characterizing uncertainty in hazard characterization. And it sets out a framework for how to do this, rather than just an individual guidance document saying how you do one part of the risk assessment. It sets the whole thing in a framework, indicating the need for tiers, indicating the interactions with other things which are going to affect like the risk assessment, such as the use of the default factors or not, whether you need to introduce more advanced modelling. And the point of the exercise is to properly take into account uncertainty and characterize it properly within your risk assessment, so that the risk manager or the decision maker can understand more about how the decision has been reached. Bottom right is development of chemical specific adjustment factors, which is another area which WHO and others have developed over the last 15 years or so, moving away from the default factors to cover uncertainty, inadequate data, lack of no adverse effect level, things like that, into a more chemical specific factor which is more informed by better information about the substance concerned. To develop, WHO did a review of the use of this over the last 10 years, and we found more than 100 examples in published assessments where this idea has been taken up and used, and it's shown increasing use of modelling, such as pharmacokinetic modelling, increased use of in vitro methods to understand the human system better, if I can call it that. All of these are developments which represent, I think, improvements in the risk assessment process, many of which reflect some of the recommendations which came out of the Silver Book. Another example not illustrated is taking better account of different age groups in your population, different vulnerable groups. The World Health Organization has published guidance on what we call life stages. So that's identifying different groups by their age or stage in life, such as infants, young children, adolescents, because each of those groups may have very different exposure profiles because of their size, even their shape, the way they move around, the activities that they do, and the things that they encounter. And so you get a better informed risk assessment if you take consideration of those different groups and the different exposures that they may experience. I'd like now to illustrate in the next slide a way of illustrating uncertainty and variability, which was an important aspect of the Silver Book, but also communication with risk managers. Now, this is the outcome of a process which was developed in a WHO publication on characterizing hazard in characterizing uncertainty in hazard characterization, taken further by the authors to consider exposure as well. And it illustrates better than the single point estimate which Thomas was talking about, a more complete picture for a risk manager. So instead of comparing your single exposure level with a single, say, toxicity reference value or a health-based guidance value, and seeing how the two compare as this bright line position, you instead compare the exposure against the hazard information, but as a probability distribution, a sort of approximate probabilistic process was suggested in this particular publication. And what you do is you show the confidence intervals on the hazard characterization and the confidence interval on the exposure. And it gives you more information, just those single points. In fact, if you look very closely, you can see a single triangle and a single diamond on that picture, which would have shown the single value. But by showing the distributions, you actually get these circles or ovals. Visually speaking, the more over towards the green area it is, the greater the margins of safety, as it were, and you are in a comfortable risk assessment position. The more you move into the red, there's more evidence of harm. And you can see where your circles are located. Are you comfortably in the green area? Or maybe are you on the edge of the red area? Now, this is probably something which risk managers can better understand. How safe are they from that conclusion? You can also tell something from the shape about where the uncertainties are. This illustration actually shows two different groups being assessed, the blue and the black. The black has maybe even distribution of both the exposure and the hazard information, but the blue oval is just as wide maybe on the hazard information side, but on the exposure side the variability is more narrow. And so you can see that if you want to refine the assessment for the population represented by the blue oval, you already have quite good information for exposure. You should concentrate on getting more information on the hazard side in order to refine the assessment. The smaller your circle or oval, the more confidence you can have in your outcome. So if you can present your risk manager a small circle clearly in the green area, you're telling them one thing. If you're showing them a very large circle which crosses both the green and the red area, then there is perhaps much greater sort of concern. So I hope I've indicated some areas where we can demonstrate increased reliability in the assessment that we do, and perhaps better ways of communicating the outcome of that assessment. But have we done anything to increase credibility? And that's maybe a different question. And for that, we need to look at those other areas which the framework in the Silver Book suggested, outside of that central green area, the parts more around the outside. So one way that we can increase credibility is by working together better. By harmonizing the way things are done, you increase consistency of decisions taken by different jurisdictions. You can also increase capacity of different agencies like taking part, which was a recommendation in the Silver Book. An example of this being the WHO Chemical Risk Assessment Network, which brings together many institutions around the world to try and harmonize the methodology we use. A development over the last 10 or 12 years has been the WHO guidance development process, which introduced a more formal process for developing WHO guidelines, introducing more systematic approaches, having predefined protocols, taking account of your risk assessment on wider considerations like gender. How is it going to affect human rights? Are you affecting adversely other members of the population? How to get the guideline out into the communities where the answer is needed, where the guidance is needed, better communication of that output. And what are you going to do? How are you to adapt that for use in the field, and taking account of making sure you update it with time, working within a framework, which didn't happen so much before when things would be developed in more of an ad hoc basis. There are also examples at the bottom of areas where WHO committees have tried to widen involvement. Instead of selecting from a small group of experts that the organisation is familiar with. You publish calls for experts in different fields, and you create rosters of experts with different types of expertise that can be called on for different assessments. When a substance, a chemical substance in my case, is being assessed, you put out a public call for data to say in so many months this substance is going to be evaluated. Please send us the data you think we should consider. In the area of chemicals, for example, there is maybe a lot of regulatory guideline data available, but less consideration may be taken of the published scientific literature. That can be addressed by calls for data and giving other groups a chance to get their information in front of the experts to be considered, and having public and peer review of the process so that different groups can feel more involved with what happens. Specifically for the example of COVID-19, WHO was called on to make a huge number of recommendations and guidance in a short period of time. The guidance that was going to be needed had to be timely, had to be produced quickly, had to be relevant, and it had to be coherent with different things which were being recommended. And it also, at the same time, despite being quick, had to adhere to proper methodology. And so a publications review committee was established to really speed this process up. Normally, guidance like this will be developed over a period of months. This committee was meeting 3 times a week, producing decisions in 2 or 3 days. And this was done to ensure that the guidance which the organisation was producing was still credible, even though it was being produced rapidly, that we weren't cutting corners. So we've looked at some of the things which have changed, but I think there are still some challenges which remain. Things are getting more complex in terms of science. On the right, it's just a body weight graph. This is how things were done maybe 20 years ago. You only needed a scales and you presented the results on a graph. And it's very easy to see difference between the groups. On the right, this is gene expression analysis from advanced molecular biology like techniques. Much more complex to do. Tells us more about what's going on perhaps in the human, but it's much more difficult to relate to a clear outcome. Much more difficult to put into the risk assessment context. Things that we're not so good on are balancing different risks. We're good at doing single assessments with a very clear outcome, such as a regulatory decision. We're much worse at considering different risks and benefits, taking into account non-scientific issues such as societal values. Cost-benefit analysis was mentioned before. For example, when you're looking at vector control for controlling disease, you sometimes have to compare the potential hazards of using a chemical or a technique against the need to protect the population from a disease. And you may accept the continuing risk while you look for low-risk alternatives because of the need to control that disease. We're not good at getting feedback on the outcomes of assessments. It's easier to do pre-market authorization assessments than it is to do post-market surveillance once something is out on the market. The data get more complicated. You're looking at epidemiology studies, the results of biomonitoring. The procedures are much more ad hoc. You don't have the same formal procedures. There is more uncertainty in that, and it's harder to take into account. But the risk assessment is not usually going to be enough on its own. There has to be other considerations, like political considerations will always come into it. How precautionary you should be in responding to something when you don't have that detailed information, when there is still uncertainty. The pace of change is very quick. Scientific progress increases faster than understanding of science. So you have to balance making rapid decisions with the need to do full evaluations. If you leave a gap in between, that tends to be filled with misinformation. We need to do a better job of connecting with wider society. In many cases, the risk assessor will be interacting with perhaps industry, with perhaps government agencies, perhaps civil society, non-government organisations which are specialised in the field but don't represent the public as a whole, and they're feeding their responses to the risk manager. But there's maybe a barrier between the general public, the media, stories on social media, and if we don't get better at getting everybody more involved, then they'll be more susceptible to that potential misinformation or acting on partial information. So finally, in conclusion, I'd like to say that I think risk assessment is changing and that progress has been made. We see much more in the way of problem formulation and using systematic approaches and being more transparent about how things are done. But there are still challenges which remain to be overcome. And in order to be credible, that credibility, I think, has to be earned. Thank you for your attention. I hand back to Gérard.
Thank you very much, Richard, for this presentation. It's a good illustration of the framework of risk assessment applied in your organization, the WHO. I have a first question in the chat, but it's a question both for you and for Thomas. I think that is that concern the concept of holistic risk assessment and is evolution in the framework of WHO IPCS 2001 framework. The question is, can the current paradigm of value-free science can implement the vision? I don't know if the question is very good, understandable from you.
I think maybe it refers to the scientific assessment taking place in an absence of other values, saying the science is the science, and we only need to take account of the science and not be influenced by maybe political considerations. But I think in order to have credibility, then those societal values still have to be taken into account, such as the need to protect vulnerable members of the population. So that is what I would understand from that.
So I have a question for you, but maybe we can also ask again this question in the general discussion, but the question is interaction with the stakeholders and society. What recommendation can you make beyond the simple aspects of communication or transparency of the method in the interaction of scientists with decision makers and stakeholders?
Well, it's very important, clearly, that there is good interaction between the scientists making the assessment and the decision makers, so the decision makers understand the limitations maybe of the assessment and its uncertainties. But I think also that the wider population needs to understand that the answers which come out of an assessment may not be completely clear, and they need to appreciate that understanding, that uncertainty which exists, because people have a natural tendency, I think, to like clear answers because it makes them feel more comfortable, but that may simply not be possible, and so you have to manage people's expectations maybe when you start the process to say, we are going to try and assess this, but recognize we may not be able to come to a clear answer. And I think the other sort of panelists may also have an opinion on this type of topic.
I would like to just add one thing about stakeholder review. I feel, particularly with the challenges to independence of peer review, that the line between stakeholder comment and peer review has been blurred, especially in the US, with the appointment of industry officials to scientific review panels and those with apparent conflicts of interest to the peer review. So as we think about stakeholder review, we have to really understand the line between input from the stakeholders, those impacted by decisions, and independent scientific peer review.
Okay. Another question to Richard. Can the media's reaction be taken into consideration in risk assessment?
Taken into consideration? That's
Yeah.
in the sense of the assessment has to come to the best outcome that it can. If the outcome is going to be difficult for some of the parties involved and will attract a lot of media attention, that's something which has to be managed and rather than avoided, I think. Maybe offering briefing to the media to help them understand more about how it is done maybe can help, but I think it definitely has to be managed rather than trying to avoid it, because as I think I said, in the absence of, if there are any gaps, if you leave a vacuum, then it is likely to be filled with either misinformation or partial information. And so I think it's important to try to ensure that there are no gaps to be filled with that misinformation or that partial information, because you cannot control what people are going to think, but at least you can give the best information and try not to leave any gaps. And some people may not like the outcome that's going to come, but that's a process which simply has to be managed.
Okay. Are there other questions in the chat? No, I don't see that. So we can have some question in the general discussion. Now it's time to move to the next speaker. That is Myriam Merad from the CNRS France. Myriam Merad is a civil engineer. She has a PhD in management science, decision aiding, and her fields of expertise are in risk, resilience, and sustainability governance, and decision analysis in safety, security, and health environments. And she has joined INERIS, the National French Institute for Environment and Industrial Risk previously. And in 2010, she chaired for the French Ministry of Environment at a national level a working group on sustainable development governance within public organizations. She was nominated at the French National Center for Scientific Research, CNRS, as a research professor, and she chaired in Anses a working group on integrated approach for food safety, biological and chemical hazards, and she coordinates different projects on different type of risks. So Merad is also active in many other risk-related institutes and scientific society in France. And Myriam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gérard. I'm very happy to be here. So my talk and my contribution today will be to discuss the link between science and public policy, and how the way we conceive the link between science and policy will influence our relation to risk assessment and risk management, and by the way, risk governance. And I will give an example on food safety. So let's go back to this famous front piece of the book of Thomas Hobbes. It was published in 1651, and it represents how a good decision, meaning a good public decision, should be taken. You see that the king, that is the public power at this period, represent a common interest. And you see that the citizen frame his body. At his left, he has the power and a vision, a short and long-term vision of what are the socio-economical constraints within the city. At his left, he has the monarchical, the ecclesiastic power, and it means that he has a vision of what can be the value that are important for the citizen, but also what kind of evidence that should be taken. Let's consider it like this. At a certain point, we have at the left what is the power and socio-economical constraint, And at the right, what are the scientific evidence and the value? So this vision of separation between power and science had an impact on our society and the way we have considered the link between risk assessment and risk management and risk governance. So it's like if we want to do a good science, we should not be contaminated about the context in which risk management measures will be taken. And you will see that within the past time, some people have been able to see how we can influence science by framing problems. Let me go back to one example that happened in the 20s of the last century. This is a book written by Edward Bernays, and I don't know if you are familiar with Edward Bernays. He was the nephew of Freud, and he used to work on marketing. And he understood that scientists and science could influence some decision and could be influenced. So at this time, he was working for a company, and the name of the company is Beechnut Packing Company. And the problem that they have exposed to Edward Bernays was the following. We want to sell more bacon. So how you can help us to sell more bacon? So Bernays, for sure, has known that the science, and mainly the physician, can influence the way we will take decision. And we will consider the bad and the good of some category of food. So he has framed the question like this. He went to some physicians and asked them, might a heavier breakfast be more beneficial for an American public? And the answer of the different physicians were yes. So at the end, the slogan was the following of this company, the Beechnut Packing Company, was that physicians recommend to eat bacon during the breakfast. And that's how egg and bacon became a famous plate at the breakfast time. So you see, by framing the question, we can influence science. So my suggestion, and that will be my conclusion that I will illustrate hereafter, is that we cannot separate the two. For sure, we have to separate the duties of the people that are doing the two, meaning the actors that and experts that work on risk assessment, and the one that work on risk management. However, if we want to have a sound risk assessment, scientists and experts has to understand how the problems came to them. So that means that we need to think this kind of connection between risk assessment and risk management. And we have to think about this organizational and governance mechanism that help us to bring together some criteria, some information that can enlighten the risk assessment process and can use and can make more credible, more transparent, more legitimate the conclusion that came from the risk assessment process. So, and then let's go in details. We will see that this kind of separation between evidence in science and risk assessment will influence the way we consider the link between risk and safety. A lot of you, Thomas, Richard, has given us some information on how we consider risk. If you go to the different communities of people that work on risk science and also that work on risk, you can see that there is a lot of definitions that are used. These definitions can be dependent on some scientific backgrounds, scientific culture, for example, dose consequence, or some other people that use probabilistic approach to characterize the risk and the potentiality of some consequence on health and environment. But also some other definition that comes from the ISO norm more recently, and when I say more recently, it's more than 10 years, but they are influencing this definition, that is, risk is the uncertain consequence of an event and his impact on reaching the objective. This definition is now being more and more famous in organization. And you have at the French level, this definition, this last one that you see, risk as a combination of hazard and vulnerable stakes, that is in the Bachelor Law of 2003, and that still have an influence on different sectors, whatever are the sector, industrial sector, natural hazard, or health and safety. What we can say is that before performing a risk assessment, we have to agree on how we define risk, not on the leading community that is performing the risk assessment, but how risk is defined for the other communities, such as the regulators, such as the people that will have to live with these different conclusions of the risk assessment and the measures that have to be taken. So we can say that a risk modeling, so a risk assessment and risk management or risk governance is a multi-stakeholders, and these stakeholders can be scientists or non-scientists, and it's a multi-criteria problem. So we can rethink the definition of risk based on the different evidence and based on the different preference that comes from the different stakeholders and the problem that they have in mind. We have another challenge when it comes to risk, is that if I take, for example, the case of food safety, we'll see that within the same community, for example, if we take for toxicologists, and it's a feedback that I will share with you here after of the working group Anses on food safety, integrated approach on food safety, we've noticed that the definition of what is a risk for people that are working on microbiology or what is the risk for people that are working on toxicology and the criteria that they use to describe risk are not the same. So,
Myriam,
oui?
Myriam,
Oui?
désolé juste de vous interrompre très légèrement. Est-ce que vous pouvez bouger un peu le micro? Il semble qu'il y ait des bruits parasites.
Ah oui.
Peut-être qu'il est trop près de vos cheveux.
Ah d'accord, c'est une très très bonne. Alors je ne sais pas. Je pense plus que c'est des travaux. Est-ce que c'est mieux?
Ça va mieux.
Ah oui, donc c'était ma chaîne. C'est une bonne observation. Désolée. Est-ce que c'est mieux comme ça?
C'est pas grave.
Yes. So,
ouais, c'est bien. Merci beaucoup.
That's uncertainty, the impact of uncertainty on the presentation. So I was saying that, for example, if we take the different communities, scientific communities, what is defined as a risk for one community is not how the other community, scientific community, define risk. Here, for example, on the case of food safety working group, the name of the working group was Praline. We take the example of these hazard, that is cadmium, and then we take this example of milk. So let's imagine that the cadmium is in the milk. So the hazard is the substance, so is the stressor, and what is the consider as a risk is the exposure of the people to and the food to this substance. The category of risk that we can have, there can be acute risk. And if we see within this working group, what was considered as acute risk was more a hazard that are coming from, that were biological hazard. For the second category of risk, chronic risk, it was more using the chemical stressor. And then within the working group, we had this double constraint to consider two categories of risk within an integrated approach to food. So how we can consider things that will appear within the long term and things that will appear within the short term. There are two other categories of risk that I'm going to show you. The one that is the diffuse risk, meaning the interaction between different substances and different stressors, but also accidental risk, meaning what can be done within this food context by adding a large quantity of substance, but a more malicious use of some substance. As you can see, all the working group, and this is just an illustration, all the member of the group doesn't have the same view of the category of risk should be considered, but also within this different category of risk, they don't use the same criteria, the same definition of what is the risk, and then the kind of attribute to define this category of risk. And then when it comes to safety, so in general, in safety, the idea was to work on the known risk, meaning the occurrence of an event, the vulnerability of the exposed people or the system and subsystems that are exposed, work on information, accountability, but also propose some audit and control measures and adaptation measures. When it comes to this case of food and safety, the development of integrated approach. Sorry, I have some problem with the slides. The main topic was focusing on health, food, and safety. And the idea was to both focus on two categories of risk, acute and chronic, because within the group, we have a majority of people that came from toxicology and microbiology, even if in the group, we had people working on economy and sociology and decision science also. The idea at the end, the risk assessment should help also to set up the right public-private health insurance mechanism. It could have been done, but we have stopped here, and I will tell you why. And we have also to consider some effect of some strategy of a risk management strategy on the way risk assessment conclusion are used, and how to improve citizen awareness. In the working group, we've stopped on this first level because we had a strong discussion between what is a matter of science and mainly a risk assessment, and what was considered the three last bullet points as being a matter of risk management. So it was a huge debate on that. And we came to also this point is that for a large majority of the members, and it's not only the working group, but also if we go back to other risk community, what is considered as risk to be regulated is the proven risk, meaning the risk where we have known negative, meaning known we have enough data and knowledge to make the link between the cause and the consequence on health or environment. And we have a perception of this problem, meaning we have a feeling that this problem is a major one. All the other categories that you see here are not taken into account. This has an impact. The impact is the following. So let me show you the final graphic. The impact is the following, is that we over-focus on the proven risk with certain category of methods, and that are cause-consequence method. There can be sometimes probabilistic method or possibilistic method, but what is at the core of prevention and risk assessment method for prevention is that we have to work on known event. When it comes to events where we don't have enough evidence, and what I call here suspected risk and unknown risk, there is a range of methods that could be used that are for the moment not used because that is not considered as being important for the risk assessment. So, and these category of risk, we should use other kind of approach, such as, for example, network approach, or graph theory, or possibilistic approach, or some category of multi-criteria approach. So we have a big challenge here on risk assessment is to develop method for both risk prevention, risk assessment used on prevention, but also method for risk assessment used on what I call here the governance of unknown, meaning how to support mechanisms such as the precautionary principle and the exoneration principle. At the right of your screen, you have two other contexts where risk assessment could be applied. These recovery management are some methods that are used by the insurance and insurance sector, where in emergency management, here, the formal method on risk assessment are not valuable with within this context. So what do we need? We need something that could help to go beyond what the known risk and consider for risk regulation, reconnect science with risk regulation and consider acute, chronic, accidental, different sector, different actors, and actors' perception of what could be risk, whatever the level of evidence that we have. And proportionate method that could help to, formal method that can use this kind of perception and knowledge and integrate that for risk management. We need then, I don't know what I'm suggesting here is a kind of council with different disciplines, and these discipline should be, so we have to consider for sure health science, but also socio-economical, political science, not only on risk management and governance, but also on framing problem for risk assessment. So these disciplines should be within the risk assessment, considered within the risk assessment process and not after. We also can gather some perception and socio-political constraint in the way problems are framed for risk assessment. I could illustrate this for food and safety regulation in France. If Gérard is okay, I still have time. Gérard?
Okay. Okay.
So one other point that I would like to say is that the matter of rethinking risk assessment is not a matter of method. It's also a matter of organization. And the way we separate, for example, here is an example of the regulatory system in France. The way we separate in the ministries, we make the separation between the ministries, the agencies, and the control, the inspection, and the way referral for risk assessment are done are not the same in the different countries. They are not, the French system is different from the UK system, from the Netherlands, or from the US. And to understand methodology, we have also to understand the specificities between these organizational structure that influence method and influence body of evidence that are taken into consideration within both risk assessment and in risk management. So the case study that I was sharing with you is coming from the working group Anses on the development of integrated approach for food safety, considering both chemical and microbiological hazard. You will find on Anses the final report and the conclusions that you can download. For the moment is in French, but for sure some papers will be published in English. And you will find what have been done that I have just presented before, meaning how we have integrated both chronic and acute risk. And now I will discuss about what could have been done, and we started doing it, but we've not moved to the end. So here was the problem. We have the set at your left of food, and we have in the middle a set of chemical stressor that we call in this context hazard, and we have biological stressors. The combination between these three elements can give scenarios of contamination of a food. These scenarios are made from credible, hazards where we have enough evidence that show that they can be on the food and that can have an impact, and of a collection, a scenario of hazard, meaning interaction between different hazards that can be on one food. Some of these scenarios can lead to chronic risk. Some others can lead to acute risk. And some of them are known risk, and some other were emergent risk. So here is an example. One food, that is the milk, and you see arsenic and aluminum, calcium, and salmonella. We can have a lot of combinations that are possible, but and we can also gather and work with qualitative and quantitative data and criteria that can help to deal with this different scenario of contamination of a food, whether we have known risk or not. We could also, for the risk assessment and not only for risk management, consider socioeconomical issues that influence the characterization of risk. If we consider for sure that health is not a matter of purely health, but is a matter of social and economical and contextual element. So we can have three kinds of ranking in the risk assessment that is purely health and socioeconomic. And how we can work, so we can gather different scientists coming from different disciplines. That can be, for sure, of course, toxicology and microbiology, but also people that work on political science, sociology, and economy. And we can map the way they represent risk. So we can do cognitive mapping. Starting from the cognitive mapping, we can identify a set of criteria. For each set of criteria, we can identify a set of indicators that characterize this criteria. And for each criteria, we can identify the weight. What are the weight? We have a problem here with the slides. The weight is the way each expert or stakeholder consider a scenario of contamination of a food. And then also at the end, we can gather both health, economic, and societal issue, but also uncertainty and criteria, and then rank them on different category of vigilance or different category of risk for each food. We can also go further and do this kind of things. We can nudge the risk by risk assessment. We can nudge the risk management process. And here can be a solution, for example, is that let's imagine that we have the food. We can have different category at your left of contaminant. And we can also identify different stakes, people that are exposed. And we can do the ranking according to the different isolated hazard, but also the combination of hazard that you see at the end of the list. And we can also show how the different measures that have been taken can influence the level of risk within the food. And that could nudge some solution that can be taken both by the consumer or the risk manager. I'm stopping here. So to resume, for sure we need to have separation of duty of whom is doing risk assessment and whom is doing risk management and risk governance. However, for a good risk assessment process, we have to think about the framing of problem. And this framing of problem should be done knowing who are the actors that are the main actors within the risk assessment process, the risk management process. So I'm stopping here. Thank you.
Thank you, Myriam, for this excellent presentation and a good vision of a global risk assessment of in the field of food safety. We can move now to a general discussion. I don't know if Thomas is now with you because there is a big storm in Baltimore and he was disconnected. And I don't know if he was connected again. So we can start the discussion with Myriam and Richard, hoping that Thomas can be again with us at the end of this discussion. So first question in the chat: can the multidisciplinary debate be obscured by the multiplicity of voice that speak? How manage interdisciplinary discrepancies in risk assessments?
Yeah.
Myriam, you want to start
Yeah. In fact, managing group is a method and also a discipline is based on disciplinary, the multidisciplinary approach. So if you want to have a fruitful discussion and a co-framing of risk assessment, we have to frame the participatory process. And there is a set of methods to do it, how we organize group, how we organize how we understand the different vision of the member of the group, if they are opposed to some solution, or if they want to push some solution, if they want to see some criteria and push away some criteria. So they are technique of to engineer the participative process before starting working. And so, and this kind of technique, you have a different, let's say, practical case where they were applied. For example, on the case of the working group, Anses working group, where we have tried to make different communities, different scientific community discuss together. And the idea first is to try to find what are the different perception of what is risk and what are the different perception and of what are the main methods that should be used. And then come to a common vocabulary before starting working. Otherwise, we will discuss about things that are not the same and we will not understand ourselves.
Richard, additional comment?
I think it's important also, even before you perhaps get to form such a group, is that within governments you have different agencies and different government departments and ministries which have different remits, and getting them to collaborate together is maybe a step which has to take place even before you can form such a group and apply such rules, because in many countries there are different departments with different remits and it can be very difficult for them to work together. Anses maybe is a very good example of integrating different areas and remits and jurisdictions together within a single organization, which is not replicated in many countries in my experience. But that challenge of getting different parts of maybe a government to work together and also with other stakeholders is very important, to take a public health approach and a One Health approach, which has to bring in these different considerations.
Thank you. Maybe we have Thomas again with you, I hope. Another question concern the translation of scientific conclusion in more comprehensible terms. So to what extent do risk communication can assist risk assessments, in particular to translate scientific conclusion to comprehensive terms, when in particular when social science it's unfortunately frequently the case when social science was not included in the risk assessment.
Yeah. Maybe I can start. There is different approach to risk communication. One of the traditional one is to use the long research conclusion done on risk perception and the bias on decision. So if we understand what are the different perception and mechanism, and you have a lot of research on that you are for sure familiar with, that the work of Kahneman and Tversky, of Slovak, you can do something with the information. You will see what are the information, the conclusion, and the kind of information that you will present on your conclusion that will fulfill the objective you need. This is an approach to risk communication to understand what is going on with your final user of conclusion. Another approach to risk communication is to think differently, not to think that the risk assessment should provide conclusion and after the conclusion should be communicated. But this approach say no, risk communication have to be think of at the beginning. We have to think about this global governance structure. That is a point of my presentation, is think at the beginning of the category of problems that and the category of expectation that your public, your stakeholders are waiting for. And at the end, you will see that it's not a matter of more simple conclusion to present, but is how to fulfill the needs they have within a category of problem and the conclusion that they are waiting for. Richard?
Yeah, I would agree that one of the recommendations of the Silver Book was that risk assessments should increase their utility, was the word which was used, and effective risk communication at the end of the process is part of making the risk assessment more useful, and it should be, how it's going to be done should be built into the planning for how a successful risk assessment will be done. And I'm starting to see examples where this point is understood. It's the importance of risk communication is becoming better understood. The WHO has recently undertaken a risk assessment of microplastics in different media, in drinking water, in soil, in food, and it has involved multiple types of discipline, including different media and environmental considerations. And that expert meeting also included a contribution from a social scientist in order to help people to understand how that people would be coming at this issue from many different perspectives. And so that's the first example which I've seen in practice where this is starting to be put into actual practice.
Okay. Yes, Myriam, do you want to add something?
Yeah, now I was also reading the questions and the comment. So maybe I'll let you, Gérard, share them, and then maybe I will comment on that. It was about social scientists.
A question for Richard regarding consistency of risk assessment and working together better. How do you see this coming, taking into account the problem's formulation, which can be very different, for example, between the European approach and the US one?
The harmonization has traditionally been more at the earlier stages of the risk assessment, and if there have been differences between countries, not just between Europe and North America, but maybe with Australia or Japan, other areas of the world which undertake risk assessment, will be in the later decisions of how much uncertainty was considered to be acceptable, whether additional factors needed to be put in, whether you needed to take particular care of specific populations. Those are the areas where there's tended to be a difference, which is more at the decision stage rather than the earlier steps in the risk assessment. But there has been considerable harmonization over time. I think, go back earlier, the different countries within Europe would make different decisions, and the European Union has developed processes which are much more harmonized. And then you take that further to people exchanging at least parts of their assessment between different jurisdictions in the world through organizations such as the OECD, the Organization for Economic Development, which has allowed at least some sharing of the work, but recognizing that final decisions are always made in the jurisdiction concerned, because there is always the competence is always national authority.
Thank you, Richard. I think maybe Thomas is trying to join us. General comments and question concern the place of social science and humanities in the expertise beyond the simple aspect of risk communication, and what about integrating humanities like social science, but also ethics, for example, on early stage in the process of risk assessment and expertise.
Yeah, let me share 3 points.
Yeah, you can speak from your examples in Anses, but also in your global professional life.
Yeah, let's say there are 3 points to share with you. The first one is we have to reconsider the social and humanities science, and when I mean we have to reconsider them, we have to consider that they are science and they give evidence of science, where for the moment there is a kind of tendency to consider social science and humanities as being fruitful for risk management and risk governance. I'm not saying that it's a good thing, but we have to consider that these social science could be integrated on the risk assessment process. The second point to consider is that the way social science and humanities work is not the same way other science work. Social science can use 2 or 3 approaches that can be, in general, they help to frame problem or to describe what is going on. Where when you have sciences that are more prescriptive, meaning that are they have a closed problem and try to solve the problem and not rediscussing the limits of the problem. Thomas was using the term wicked problem. So in this wicked problem, humanities and social science can help to understand the different category of problems that we can face. So yeah, for sure, we have to involve more social and humanities science within expertise process, I mean within risk assessment. The third point is how we can do that. And my experience is the following, is that and mainly on public sector, is that in general, when we have let's say some economical constraints within the public sectors, the first disciplines that live with this constraint are the social and humanities science. So we have a tendency to reduce the budget of social and humanities, and we will focus on what we consider the hard science. So we have to find kind of mechanism. Sure, Anses have a group that work on that. So you have to think about how to maintain this discipline within these public institutions, agencies, or institutes that contribute to risk assessment. I'm stopping here. Thomas or Richard? Yeah.
A question concerning Myriam, but also I think Richard. Recently, the French Agriculture and Food Ministry said to the members of the French Parliament during a discussion on nitrates in cured meat that the opinion of the European Food Safety Agency was based on the risk assessment, and opinion of IARC, in International Agency for Research on Cancer, based on hazard assessments about this nitrate in meat. And he said he doesn't know what to think about it if the French public policies are based on hazard assessment and not on risk assessment. Would it be better for the trust of the French citizen in the food safety?
That's a good question. Let's say one also 3 points. I think that even the notion of what is a hazard assessment and risk assessment is dependent on the dominant scientific culture. Let me be provocative. I know I'm looking at the list and I have some member of the working group that are attendees on this meeting. But what I've noticed is that what I was familiar with on risk assessment approach in general in different sectors were for me, when I was looking to toxicology, was for me was more a hazard-based approach. And you see, but for them, it was a risk-based approach. So we don't have the same convention of vocabulary. So first, we have to discuss what is a hazard approach. Whatever are the guidelines, there is a lot of guidelines in different institutions, but there is also some convention within different disciplines, and we have to discuss about that. The second things here is when we focus on hazard, we are more let's say we avoid certain category of problem rather than when we focus on risk. Let me just give you an example of air pollution. So as I told you, I used to be on another institute called UNICE, and I was working on how to integrate social science when we deal with air pollution. And one of the maps that were produced that some of you could be familiar with, very interesting map that are more hazard map that you can go and look at them. These maps are Prévert. They produce some pollutant maps, and you see the different level of alert within these different pollutants. But if you go back to these maps, you will see that we missed one information that could make them become risk maps, and they in certain situations are not well understood by citizens because they are confused by a pollution indexed where that give another information. So if we have added the information on risk, meaning how these different hazard has an impact on health and has an impact on the environment, we should have more, let's say, more effective information to the citizen. These maps are effective for the regulators. They are useful for the regulators, but the risk map for citizens should be improved by using another information. So what I'm saying here is that depends on what we want to produce and what are the information that we want to share with the decision maker or the citizen. It can be useful to go back to the convention of vocabulary and know what are the useful information for the final users. So it's not a matter of hazard map or risk maps. It's a matter of what we need to take in life decision and reduce our exposure or reduce our risk. Don't want to go too far.
Richard, which is your opinion about hazard, risk, and trust of citizens?
To follow on from what Myriam has said about things being, as we would say in English, fit for purpose, but things have different purposes, and I think the purpose of the IARC assessment is looking at the hazard assessment for carcinogenic risk and identifying something which may be a carcinogenic risk according to the criteria which they have, but they're not making public health recommendations as to what to do about that. The intention being to highlight to agencies which have a public health mandate that this is an issue which you might need to take some action on or not. So in the example of cured meats, that information is taken up by the Food Safety Authority, like for the EU, to then make a consideration of is this a public health problem within our jurisdiction of concern. And so it's about understanding the purpose of the assessment which is done. But of course it's important to make sure that people are using the same language, the same vocabulary when they are describing what they do, to understand what the purpose of that assessment was.
Okay, there is a question for Thomas, but I don't know if Thomas is able to hear you or us. No, it was a question about the implementation of recommendation of several books in US EPA, and is there a progress report available? But I don't know, and if Thomas is not here, I'm afraid we can answer to the question. Myriam,
Thomas is here.
You have some information?
Thomas is here, but his his microphone is not active. But I think he should hear us, or maybe he can use the chat.
Thomas, you can speak?
I think it's the problem with the microphone only. Yeah.
Microphone is switched on? So, no, it's too difficult for him.
Yeah.
Sorry, I had a last question for you concerning the integration of alternative expertise into policy arenas as part of more open and deliberative form of risk decision making. How do you think we can deal with that today?
Yeah.
With these alternative expertise from NGOs, for example.
Let me just distinguish two things. That the term expertise in French mean both knowledge and but he mean also a process of production of knowledge. Where in English, I have discovered these last years that it doesn't mean the two. So when we use the term expertise, in the French context, we mean also the process of producing knowledge together.
Yeah.
So that being said, if we want to include some third part within the expertise, the classical expertise process, there is two ways of including them. And they are not exclusive, these two ways that can be used together. Depends on what are the expectations, by the way. They can be, stakeholders can be included at the beginning of the process to frame what are the problems, to frame what are the criteria that could be considered, what are the elements of knowledge. And when I say knowledge, can be scientific knowledge or knowledge of the context. I mean, the knowledge of the territory, what we call vernacular knowledge. So they can help framing at the beginning the different category of problem. They can also, and depends on what are the willingness of the people that just produce this expertise and have the power to influence this expertise process. It can be possible also to involve them in the expertise process. But before that, there is some steps. The first one is a common vocabulary, but also the common problems in the set of this, in this weak problem, the subset of problems that we start tackling together. And according to the problem, we will see who are the actors that are more interested by one problem rather than the other. And then there is participation, a way to engineer this participation process using MCDA, multi-criteria and multi-actors method that help you to go into what frame preference of stakeholders, what frame their opinion, what are their expectation, their vision of the world. And then there is, after that, a framing process, a formal framing process that will come from different point of view and different criteria to a set of conclusions that we will have to discuss together and see what are the impact and the influence of the perception of the different actors. And then we can go to a conclusion.
Yeah, I think some sectors are maybe more advanced in this than others. In the areas of public health I'm familiar with, it's quite early days to take account of these different sorts of approaches with different sorts of expertise. I've seen, for example, in the development of guidance, there's been more emphasis recently on the concept of lived experience, and this is people who bring their experience into the process, even if they don't have the scientific expertise or expertise acquired through qualification or position, but they have experienced the actual sort of hazard, for example, that's been concerned, and trying to incorporate that lived experience to broaden what is considered the expertise that might feed into the process. Now, how that I apologize to the interpreters as to how that may translate, but this concept of lived experience is something which I think we will see more of, particularly when it comes to not just strictly in risk assessment, but in developing guidance and adapting that guidance for use like within communities as a part of this broadening of expertise which will feed into these processes.
Thank you. I think it's time for conclusion now. Sorry, Thomas, the connection is not recorded. It's due to stormy weather, not due to the Trump administration. I can assure you, of course. And I'd like to thank all the speakers because I think that there was a clear demonstration of the importance to get a more and more global and holistic approach in the risk assessment, in the process of expertise in general, more generally, and to have an involvement of social science in the different stages of expertise, not only in the final stage of communication, and the importance, of course, of the opening of the framework of risk assessment to the society without, of course, distortion of the science and conclusion of the science. So I like to thank, of course, you, Richard, Myriam, and Thomas, but also all the colleagues from Anses that ensure the organization of the symposium and the different breakout sessions. It's a hard work. All the colleagues, of course, of the scientific committee and organization committee of the symposium. And finally, also the people ensuring the translation from English to French or French to English, and all the participants to the breakout session. Don't forget that there are other breakout sessions in the next day or weeks about different important aspects of expertise and the problematic of the credibility of expertise. So see you later in different breakout sessions, I hope, and thank you again.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.